Imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time. Picture yourself in a dusty library, facing a French archaeologist whose eyes gleam with excitement. It's the winter of 1901, and we're in Susa, in what is now Iran. Jacques de Morgan has just made a discovery that will revolutionize our understanding of humanity. Before him stands a black basalt monolith over 2 meters tall, covered in cuneiform writing. This majestic stele holds the secrets of a civilization nearly 4,000 years old. What this man doesn't yet realize is that he holds in his hands one of history's most disturbing testimonies of female oppression. For carved into this stone are the most unsettling laws ever imposed upon women. The Code of Hammurabi. But before we dive into these revelations that will chill your blood, take a moment to tell us where you're listening to this story. Are you comfortably settled at home, on public transport, or perhaps taking a walk? Don't hesitate to share in the comments. And if this journey through time fascinates you, subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any of our historical explorations. Mesopotamia. For many, this name evokes the cradle of civilization, that fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates, where everything began. Writing, the first cities, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy. But what's less often told is that this region was also the stage for one of history's most systematic codifications of male dominance. When Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon around 1792, the ancient world already knew millennia of civilization. But this ruler, with boundless ambitions, would mark history in a particularly dark way for women's condition. His 42-year reign would be one of the longest in ancient Near Eastern history, but also one of the most decisive in shaping women's fate for centuries to come. For Hammurabi wasn't merely a conqueror, he was a legislator, a man who understood that to durably establish his power over a multi-ethnic expanding empire, he needed to legally unify his territories. And thus he had carved into black stone the 282 laws that would minutely regulate the lives of his subjects. At the top of this imposing stele, a symbolic scene already reveals the ideology underlying this code. We see Hammurabi himself, standing, receiving from the god Shamash, the deity of the sun and justice, a staff and a ring, symbols of royal power. The message is clear. These laws are not the work of a man, but divine will itself transmitted to the king. But what do these laws reveal about women's condition? The first striking thing is their number. Of the 282 articles in the code, nearly a quarter, about 70 laws, directly or indirectly concern women. Never before in history had female life been regulated with such precision, such meticulousness, such cruelty. These laws unveil a society where women are categorized, hierarchized, controlled in their every gesture. They reveal a legal system that codifies inequality with disturbing administrative coldness. For Hammurabi's malevolent genius lay in transforming oppression into legal norm, violence into divine justice. To understand the scale of this legislative tragedy, we must first grasp how Babylonian society classified its inhabitants. The Code of Hammurabi officially recognizes 3 categories of human beings: the Awilam, the ruling elite, the Mushkenim, the common freemen, and the Ardum, the slaves. But this apparently simple classification hides a much more complex reality for women. For a woman, regardless of her birth, never exists fully by herself in this system. She is always defined in relation to a man, father, husband, brother, or master. Her legal value, her legal protection, her rights and duties depend entirely on her relationship with a masculine figure. This is the first lock of this oppression system, the erasure of autonomous feminine identity. But the social hierarchy doesn't stop there. Among women, the code establishes crucial distinctions that will determine their destiny. There are legitimate wives, protected but subjugated; concubines, tolerated but precarious; widows, respected but watched; religious women, venerated but controlled; slaves, owned and exploited; and finally, prostitutes, used but despised. Each of these categories obeys specific rules, particular prohibitions, distinct punishments. It's a system of formidable complexity that leaves no escape for Babylonian women. Wherever they find themselves in this hierarchy, they remain under masculine control. This social stratification also reveals a disturbing truth. Elite women aren't necessarily better off than those of the people. Certainly, they enjoy certain prestige, superior material protections, but they pay for this status through increased surveillance, reinforced constraints, crushing social expectations. A woman of Babylonian high society lives in a golden cage. She cannot go out alone, cannot choose her relationships, cannot freely dispose of her goods. Her conduct is subject to permanent examination by her family, her neighbors, the entire community. The slightest deviation can cost her life. Conversely, a slave woman paradoxically possesses certain freedoms that free women don't have. She can work, circulate, have sexual relations without this posing problem, but at the price of a legal condition that makes her an object, property that can be sold, bought, bequeathed like furniture. This gradation of oppression reveals the perverse sophistication of the Hammurabic system. It's not a brutal and uniform domination, but a differentiated control that adapts to each social situation. It's this complexity that makes the system so effective and so enduring. The consequences of this codified oppression extended far beyond ancient Babylon's borders. What Hammurabi achieved wasn't merely the creation of a legal system, it was the institutionalization of female subordination on an unprecedented scale. His code became the template that countless civilizations would follow, adapt, and perpetuate. But to truly understand the revolutionary nature of this oppression, we must delve deeper into the historical context. In 1750 BCE, Babylon was experiencing its golden age. The city had become the political and cultural center of Mesopotamia, a thriving metropolis where merchants from across the known world came to trade. The Euphrates flowed through its heart, bringing life-giving water to elaborate gardens and magnificent temples. It was in this atmosphere of prosperity and cultural flowering that Hammurabi chose to enshrine women's subjugation in stone. This wasn't the desperate act of a declining civilization clinging to outdated traditions. It was the calculated decision of a civilization at its peak, deliberately choosing to codify female oppression as a cornerstone of social order. The code itself was a technological marvel. Cuneiform writing had existed for over a millennium, but never had it been used to create such a comprehensive legal document. The 282 laws were organized thematically, written in clear, accessible language that any literate person could understand. This wasn't meant to be an obscure legal text for scholars. It was designed to be widely known and strictly enforced. What makes this particularly chilling is the systematic nature of the oppression. These weren't random customs or isolated incidents of misogyny. Every aspect of a woman's life, from birth to death, from marriage to widowhood, from sexuality to economics, was carefully regulated, controlled, and constrained by legal decree. The code distinguished between different types of women with scientific precision. A Naditu priestess faced different restrictions than a Shugitu priestess. A concubine's children had different inheritance rights than a wife's children, who in turn had different rights than an adopted child. Every category came with its own web of rules, creating a labyrinthine system of control. Consider the economic dimensions of this oppression. The code doesn't simply state that women are inferior, it quantifies that inferiority with mathematical precision. When a pregnant woman is struck and loses her child, the compensation varies dramatically based on her social status. If she's the wife of a nobleman, the attacker pays 10 shekels. If she's a commoner's wife, 5 shekels. If she's a slave, merely 2 shekels. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was systematic devaluation. The code assigned precise monetary values to women's lives, wombs, and suffering based on their relationship to men. A woman's worth was literally calculated according to her utility in the patriarchal system. The religious dimension of this oppression adds another layer of horror. By placing the code under divine protection, Ikorsi, literally depicting Hammurabi receiving these laws from the sun god Shamash, the Babylonians transformed legal oppression into religious obligation. To question these laws wasn't merely civil disobedience, it was blasphemy against the gods themselves. This religious sanctification created an ideological fortress around female oppression that would prove remarkably durable. When laws are merely human creations, they can be changed by human will. But when laws are presented as divine commandments, they become nearly impossible to challenge or reform. The code's influence spread throughout the ancient Near East, through conquest, trade, and cultural exchange. Scribal schools used it as a teaching text for over a millennium after Hammurabi's death. Its principles appeared in modified forms in Assyrian laws, Hittite codes, and even biblical legislation. The systematic oppression of women, first codified in Babylon, became a template for civilizations across the ancient world. Archaeological evidence suggests that copies of the code existed in major cities throughout the Babylonian Empire. These weren't museum pieces gathering dust. They were working legal documents, consulted by judges and referenced in court proceedings. The oppression wasn't theoretical. It was actively, daily enforced across a vast territory. The sophistication of this system reveals something profound about ancient Mesopotamian society. These weren't primitive people stumbling toward civilization. They were highly sophisticated jurists, creating complex legal frameworks. The tragedy is that they chose to use this sophistication to perfect the machinery of female oppression. The Code of Hammurabi represents one of humanity's great paradoxes. The same civilization that invented writing, developed mathematics, and created literature also perfected legal misogyny. It reminds us that technological and cultural advancement doesn't automatically lead to moral progress. But this is only the beginning of our journey into ancient Mesopotamia's dark treatment of women. The Code of Hammurabi established the framework, but the individual laws within it reveal horrors that are almost unimaginable to modern minds. When we examine how the Code of Hammurabi regulated marriage, we encounter what might be the most systematic reduction of human relationships to economic transactions in recorded history. Marriage in ancient Babylon wasn't a union of hearts or minds. It was a carefully orchestrated commercial deal involving the transfer of property, both human and material. The process began not with romance or courtship, but with negotiation between two male heads of household. The prospective groom and the bride's father would engage in complex discussions about price, terms and conditions. The woman herself was rarely consulted about her own fate. She was the commodity being traded, not a party to the transaction. The code established 5 distinct stages that every marriage had to follow for legal recognition. First came the betrothal negotiations, where the groom's family would offer the terhatu, essentially a bride price paid to the father. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a substantial payment that compensated the family for losing their daughter's economic contribution. The second stage involved the biblical equivalent of a down payment. The groom had to provide the shangu, a preliminary gift that demonstrated his serious intent and financial capacity. Failure to complete the marriage after this stage resulted in significant financial penalties, creating a binding commercial obligation. The third stage was the formal betrothal ceremony, where the bride's father would publicly declare his daughter promised to the groom. From this moment forward, any sexual contact between the woman and another man would be treated as adultery, punishable by death. Her body now belonged legally to her future husband, even though the marriage hadn't been consummated. The fourth stage involved the preparation of the marriage contract, a detailed legal document that specified the rights, obligations, and property arrangements of the union. These contracts were often more complex than modern business agreements, covering everything from inheritance rights to behavioral expectations. Finally came the wedding ceremony itself, which was primarily a public acknowledgement of the property transfer. The bride was literally delivered to her husband's house, accompanied by her dowry and any other goods specified in the contract. But the true horror of this system lay in its details. The code specified that a man could acquire a wife through multiple methods: purchase, capture in war, or receipt as payment for debt. Each method carried different legal implications, but all treated women as transferable property. The terhatu system created particularly disturbing incentives. Fathers had financial motivation to marry off their daughters as young as possible, since virginity commanded higher prices. The code doesn't specify minimum marriage ages, but contemporary documents suggest girls as young as 12 or 13 were commonly wed to men decades older. Once the terhatu was paid, the transaction became legally binding for the woman, but remained flexible for the man. If the groom changed his mind before the wedding, he forfeited his payment, but faced no other consequences. If the bride's family tried to back out, they owed double compensation, plus additional penalties. The dowry system added another layer of economic complexity. A woman's family had to provide the shariktu, property and goods, that would theoretically support her in her new household. But this property came with strict conditions. The husband controlled its use during the marriage, and upon the wife's death, it typically passed to her sons rather than returning to her birth family. This economic structure created a cruel paradox. Wealthy families could afford to provide substantial dowries that might give their daughters some security and status in their new homes. Poor families, unable to provide adequate dowries, essentially had to pay men to marry their daughters while offering little to protect them afterward. The code's marriage laws also established the legal principle that a man took possession of his wife, using the same verb applied to capturing territory or seizing property. This wasn't merely linguistic. It reflected the legal reality that marriage transferred ownership of a woman from her father to her husband. The consequences of this commercialization were profound. Women had no legal right to refuse marriages arranged by their fathers. They couldn't choose their partners, negotiate their terms, or escape unwanted unions. Once married, they became legally subordinate to their husbands in all matters. The code permitted men to take multiple wives if they could afford the payments, But women faced death for adultery. Men could divorce their wives for various reasons while retaining most of the marital property. But women who sought divorce faced severe legal barriers and potential execution if their cases weren't deemed valid. Even the language surrounding marriage revealed its commercial nature. Wives were described as being purchased, acquired, or obtained. Husbands were said to own or possess their wives. Marriage ceremonies involved delivery of the bride like any other commercial good. This system created devastating psychological consequences for women. Raised from childhood, knowing they would be sold to strangers, many women never developed a sense of personal autonomy or self-worth, independent of their utility to men. The entire culture reinforced the message that women existed primarily to serve masculine, economic, and sexual interests. The Code's marriage laws also established precedents for legitimizing domestic violence. Since wives were legally property, husbands had broad authority to discipline them as they saw fit. The law intervened only in cases of extreme brutality that threatened the wife's life or ability to bear children. And even then, the husband's property rights took precedence over the wife's physical well-being. Perhaps most disturbing was how this system normalized the complete erasure of female agency. The Code didn't simply restrict women's choices. It eliminated the very concept that women should have choices in the most intimate aspects of their lives. Marriage wasn't something that happened to both partners. It was something that happened to women, with men as the active agents and women as passive objects. This commercialization of marriage created ripple effects throughout society. It incentivized families to view daughters as economic assets rather than beloved children. It created markets in human beings that operated with the same principles as markets in livestock or grain. It established legal frameworks that reduced love, sexuality, and companionship to matters of property law. The horror of this system wasn't just its cruelty, it was its efficiency. By reducing marriage to economic transaction, Babylonian society created powerful incentives for everyone to participate in female oppression. Fathers profited from selling daughters. Husbands gained property and labor. Even mothers, having no alternatives, often became complicit in preparing their daughters for subordination. But even within this nightmare of commercialized marriage, the Code of Hammurabi contained laws that would prove even more disturbing when we examine how it punished women who dared to resist this system. Nothing in the Code of Hammurabi reveals the depths of ancient Mesopotamia's misogyny more clearly than its treatment of adultery. These laws didn't simply punish infidelity. They created an elaborate system of sexual control that used the threat of horrific death to terrorize women into complete submission. The most infamous of these laws, Article 129, has become synonymous with ancient barbarism. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall bind both of them and throw them into the water, unless the husband chooses to let his wife live, and the king chooses to let his servant live. On the surface, this might appear to treat both partners equally. Both face drowning for adultery. But the devil lies in the details. And those details reveal a system designed to grant men absolute power over women's bodies and sexuality. First, consider the phrase, caught lying with another man. The law doesn't require proof of sexual intercourse. Mere suspicion of impropriety could trigger this death sentence. A woman found alone with a man who wasn't her husband, even in innocent circumstances, could face drowning. The burden of proof was minimal, and the consequences were irreversible. The drowning method itself was chosen for maximum psychological impact. Unlike execution by sword or stoning, which could be quick, drowning was slow and torturous. The condemned were bound together and thrown into the river, forced to watch each other's final moments as they struggled desperately for air. This wasn't justice. It was spectacle, designed to terrorize other women into absolute compliance. But the law's most sinister aspect was its conditional nature. The woman's fate depended entirely on her husband's whim. If he chose mercy, she might live. If not, she died regardless of circumstances, evidence, or her own wishes. Her life literally hung on the decision of the man who owned her. The male partner's fate was similarly conditional, but crucially, it depended on royal mercy rather than the husband's decision. This created a perverse hierarchy, where the woman's life was worth less than the man's. She could be saved only by her owner's grace, while he might be spared by higher authority. Article 153 prescribed an even more horrific fate for women who dared to actively resist the system. If a woman has had her husband killed because of another man, she shall be impaled. Impalement, being pierced through the body with a sharp stake and left to die slowly, was one of the most excruciating deaths imaginable. It could take hours or even days, with the victim suffering unimaginable agony as the stake slowly worked through their organs. This punishment was reserved exclusively for women. Men who killed for love faced execution, but through quicker, less torturous methods. The choice of impalement for women sent a clear message. Female rebellion against the sexual order warranted the most extreme punishment imaginable. Article 157 decreed burning alive for another form of sexual transgression. If a man lies with his son's wife after his son's death, both shall be burned. Again, both parties faced the same formal punishment, but the social realities were vastly different. The man was typically the family patriarch, wielding enormous power over the younger woman. The law made no allowance for coercion, consent, or the power dynamics involved. The burning prescribed wasn't a quick death by smoke inhalation. Ancient Mesopotamian execution by fire typically involved being tied to a stake and having combustible materials piled around the victim's feet. Death came slowly, through a combination of burns, smoke inhalation, and eventually cardiac arrest from the extreme heat. These spectacular punishments served multiple functions in Babylonian society. They eliminated individuals who challenged the sexual order. They provided public entertainment that reinforced social hierarchies. And most importantly, they created an atmosphere of terror that prevented other women from even contemplating resistance. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of these laws was their use of ordeal by water, the river judgment. When a woman was merely accused of adultery without being caught in the act, Article 132 prescribed a different horror. If the finger has been pointed at a man's wife because of another man, and she has not been caught lying with the other man, for her husband's sake, she shall throw herself into the river. This wasn't simply execution. It was divinely sanctioned Russian roulette. The woman had to leap into the sacred river and swim for her life. If she drowned, the gods had judged her guilty. If she survived, she was innocent. Either way, the decision was removed from human hands and placed in divine ones. The psychological torture of this system was exquisite. A woman facing ordeal lived in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing whether she would survive. Even if she survived, she returned to a marriage permanently poisoned by suspicion and accusation. Her husband would always wonder whether the gods had truly vindicated her or whether she had simply been lucky. The ordeal also served to terrorize other women. Everyone in the community would witness the accused woman's terror as she prepared for possible death. They would see her family's anguish, her children's tears, her own desperate prayers. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to women who attract even the suspicion of sexual impropriety. These laws created a climate where women policed not only their own behavior, but each other's God. Knowing that mere accusation could lead to death, women became hypervigilant about appearances. They avoided any situation that might be misconstrued. They informed on each other to deflect suspicion from themselves. The system turned potential allies against each other in a desperate struggle for survival. The Code's adultery laws also revealed the economic dimensions of sexual control. When Article 129 allowed husbands to spare their wives, it wasn't mercy, it was property protection. A man who had paid substantial bride price and dowry might choose to preserve his investment rather than lose it to the river. The woman's life was spared not from love or justice, but from economic calculation. The laws made no distinction between consensual adultery and rape. A woman sexually assaulted by another man faced the same death sentence as one who willingly took a lover. The Code recognized only one form of consent that mattered: the husband's exclusive right to his wife's sexuality. Even more disturbing, the laws created positive incentives for false accusation. A husband who wanted to rid himself of an unwanted wife could simply claim to have caught her in adultery. With minimal evidence required and no legal representation for the accused, such charges were nearly impossible to refute. The cumulative effect of these laws was the creation of a society where women lived in constant terror of sexual accusation. They couldn't form friendships with men, couldn't work alongside them, couldn't even seek help from them in emergencies without risking death. The laws effectively created a form of gender apartheid, where women were isolated from half of humanity through fear. But as we'll discover, the Code of Hammurabi's oppression of women extended beyond marriage and sexuality into the very clothes they wore and the spaces they occupied. The system of control was so comprehensive that it regulated even the covering of a woman's head. The story of the veil in ancient Mesopotamia reveals one of history's most sophisticated systems of visual oppression, a method of social control so effective that its echoes persist in many societies today. But this isn't the story of religious modesty or cultural tradition. It's the story of how a piece of cloth became a weapon of systematic subjugation. The most detailed regulations about veiling appear not in Hammurabi's code, but in the later Middle Assyrian laws, dating to around 1112 to 1047. Article 40 of these laws provides a chilling blueprint for how clothing can be used to enforce social hierarchy and control women's bodies. Married women, widows, and Assyrian women shall not have their heads uncovered when they go out in the street, the law decreed. But this was only the beginning. The law continued with meticulous detail about who could veil and who was forbidden this privilege. Concubines accompanying their mistresses in public were required to veil. Sacred prostitutes who were married could veil. But unmarried women, common prostitutes, and female slaves were strictly prohibited from covering their heads. The punishment for a prostitute who dared to veil herself was having her clothes stripped off in public, receiving 60 lashes, and having hot pitch poured over her head. The punishment for a slave woman caught veiling was equally brutal. Her ears would be cut off. Any person who saw a prohibited woman wearing a veil but failed to report her to authorities would receive 50 lashes and have their clothes confiscated. This system created a visual hierarchy of women that could be read instantly by anyone in the street. A veiled woman commanded respect and protection. The door's woman's honored wife or daughter. She was someone's honored wife or daughter. An unveiled woman was fair game for harassment, exploitation, or worse. She was advertising her low status and availability to any man who cared to notice. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. For women allowed to veil, the cloth became both protection and prison. It shielded them from unwanted attention, but also marked them as possessions requiring guardianship. They couldn't remove it without losing social status and inviting assault. For women forbidden to veil, the exposure was a constant humiliation. They walked the streets marked as inferior beings, their uncovered heads advertising their vulnerability. Prostitutes and slaves faced the particular cruelty of being denied even the basic dignity of covering themselves while performing degrading work. The law's genius lay in turning women into willing enforcers of their own oppression. Veiled women had incentives to ensure that unveiled women stayed in their assigned category. To their own status depended on maintaining the distinction. Unveiled women competed desperately for the chance to cover their heads by securing marriage or freedom. The veiling laws also served economic functions. They protected the investment that men made in wives and daughters by clearly marking these women as private property. A man could walk through a marketplace confident that his wife's veiled status would deter other men from approaching her. Simultaneously, the laws facilitated the exploitation of unveiled women by marking them as publicly available. Prostitutes couldn't hide their profession. Their bare heads advertised their services to potential customers. Slaves couldn't blend in with free women. Their exposure immediately identified them as available for any use their masters permitted. The religious dimension of these laws adds another layer of oppression. The veil wasn't just a social marker, it was a sign of divine favor. The gods themselves supposedly distinguished between worthy women who deserved covering and unworthy women who should remain exposed. This transformed a legal requirement into a moral judgment about women's character and value. The enforcement mechanisms reveal the thoroughness of this system of control. The law required every citizen to become a surveillance agent, watching for women who violated the veiling codes. This created a society where women lived under constant observation, never knowing when a neighbor, stranger, or even friend might report them to authorities. The specific punishments chosen for violations weren't random. Stripping violated women naked in public reversed their attempt to claim higher status, or dot. They were reduced to even lower standing than before. The 60 lashes served as both punishment and spectacle, warning other women about the consequences of overstepping their boundaries. Pouring hot pitch over the head was particularly cruel because it often caused permanent disfigurement. A woman who survived this punishment would bear the marks for life, serving as a walking warning to others. She might also find it impossible to attract customers or secure marriage afterward, effectively condemning her to destitution. The ear-cutting prescribed for slaves served similar functions. It permanently marked the woman as having attempted to transgress social boundaries. Even if she later gained freedom, the missing ears would remind everyone of her attempt to rise above her station. These veiling laws created what sociologists now call symbolic violence, oppression exercised through cultural symbols rather than direct force. Women were controlled not through constant physical coercion, but through a visual system that made their status immediately apparent to all. The effectiveness of this symbolic violence was remarkable. Rather than requiring armies of guards to control women, the society needed only cloth and social pressure. Women policed themselves and each other, understanding that violation of the veiling codes could bring swift and brutal punishment. The laws also created artificial scarcity around female modesty. By restricting the right to veil, authorities made it a privilege that women desperately sought. This transformed an act of covering into a symbol of status, making women compete for the right to conceal themselves rather than demanding freedom of choice in their appearance. Archaeological evidence suggests that these veiling practices spread throughout the ancient Near East through conquest and cultural exchange. Assyrian military campaigns carried these laws to conquered territories, while trade networks spread the underlying assumptions about women, status, and covering throughout the region. The durability of these practices is perhaps their most disturbing aspect. The basic principle, DZR, that women's clothing should advertise their social status and availability to men, has persisted in various forms for millennia. The specific details change, but the underlying logic of visual control remains remarkably consistent. What makes the ancient Mesopotamian veiling laws particularly significant is how they reveal the sophistication of patriarchal social engineering. These weren't crude restrictions imposed by ignorant primitives. They were carefully designed systems created by advanced civilizations that understood exactly how to use symbols, incentives, and punishments to control human behavior. The veiling laws also demonstrate how oppression can be disguised as protection. By framing the veil as honor and privilege rather than restriction and control, authorities convinced many women to embrace their own subjugation. The oppressed became grateful for their chains, seeing them as marks of distinction rather than bondage. But even as these laws controlled women's public appearance, an even more disturbing form of regulation was taking place in the temples themselves, where the line between the sacred and profane created new opportunities for exploitation. Deep within the temples of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath the gilded statues of gods and goddesses, one of history's most perverse institutions flourished: sacred prostitution. This practice reveals how civilizations can transform the exploitation of women into religious obligation, creating systems of abuse that are not only legal but literally holy. The goddess Ishtar, known to the Sumerians as Inanna, stood at the center of this institution. As the deity of love, fertility, and sexuality, Ishtar embodied the complex relationship between the sacred and the carnal that characterized Mesopotamian religion. Her temples weren't just places of worship. They were centers of an elaborate system that commercialized women's bodies in the name of divine service. The Code of Hammurabi makes several references to different categories of religious women, creating a hierarchy of sacred sexuality that ranged from respected priestesses to temple prostitutes. At the top were the Entu, high priestesses who served as the earthly brides of gods. Below them were various orders of priestesses and temple servants, including the Naditu, who were forbidden to bear children, and the Lukur, who could engage in sexual activities but under strict regulations. But at the bottom of this religious hierarchy were the women who would later be known as hierodules, literally, sacred slaves. These women, often drawn from the ranks of the destitute, orphaned, or enslaved, provided sexual services to temple visitors in exchange for offerings that supported the religious institution. The practice wasn't limited to women. Male prostitutes, known as asinu, also served in some temples, often dressed in feminine clothing and performing ritualized acts that blurred gender boundaries. However, the vast majority of sacred prostitutes were women, and it was their exploitation that formed the economic backbone of this religious institution. Contemporary Babylonian scholar Jean Bottero proposed one of the most disturbing theories about the origins of this practice. He suggested that sacred prostitution began as a solution for sterile women who couldn't fulfill their primary social function of bearing children. Unable to serve individual men as wives, these women found a place in society by serving all men as sacred prostitutes, becoming wives of the god, and therefore wives of all believers. This theory, if accurate, reveals the devastating logic of a society that defined women solely by their reproductive capacity. Women who couldn't bear children faced social death unless they could find alternative ways to serve masculine sexual needs. Sacred prostitution became their only path to survival, dressed up in religious language to make the exploitation palatable. The Greek historian Herodotus provided one of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of sacred prostitution in his histories. Writing about Babylon in the 5th century, he claimed, "Every woman born in the country must once in her life go to the temple of Aphrodite, and there submit to a stranger. However small the sum, she cannot refuse it, for the law forbids her to do so. This money becomes sacred. When she has lain with him, having discharged her duty to the goddess, she may go home." Herodotus continued with details that revealed the cruel hierarchies within this system. The beautiful and tall women quickly go home, but the ugly ones spend a long time there, not being able to fulfill the law. Some wait 3 or 4 years. The implication is horrifying. Attractive women could quickly find men willing to pay for their services and escape, while less attractive women faced years of forced prostitution until someone finally chose them. While modern historians debate the accuracy of Herodotus's account, archaeological evidence and contemporary Mesopotamian texts confirm that some form of ritualized sexuality did occur in temples throughout the ancient Near East. Temple inventories list payments made to women for sexual services. Legal documents record disputes over temple prostitutes' earnings. Administrative texts track the management of women assigned to sexual duties in religious institutions. The practice wasn't confined to Mesopotamia. Similar institutions appeared throughout the ancient world, from the temple prostitutes of Cyprus to the Devadasi of India. The specific forms varied, but the basic pattern remained consistent: religious institutions exploiting women's sexuality under the guise of sacred service. What made sacred prostitution particularly insidious was how it transformed exploitation into virtue. Regular prostitution was tolerated, but socially stigmatized. Sacred prostitution was presented as noble service to the gods. Women weren't being degraded. They were fulfilling holy obligations. They weren't being exploited. They were participating in sacred mysteries. This religious framing served multiple functions. It provided ideological cover for what was essentially a highly organized system of sexual slavery. It generated substantial revenue for religious institutions through the offerings paid for sexual services. And it created a safety valve for social tensions by providing sexual outlets for men while maintaining the fiction of religious propriety. The economic dimensions of sacred prostitution were substantial. Temples operated as complex financial institutions, managing property, investments, and business enterprises throughout Mesopotamian society. The income from sexual services formed a significant portion of many temples' revenue, supporting not just the prostitutes themselves, but entire religious bureaucracies. Temple records from Uruk show that some institutions maintained hundreds of women for sexual services. These weren't occasional offerings to the gods. They were large-scale commercial operations that generated steady income streams. The women were bought, sold, inherited, and managed like any other form of property, their bodies treated as assets in religious investment portfolios. The psychological impact on the women involved is almost impossible to imagine. Many were told from childhood that their sexual exploitation was a form of divine service. They were taught to see their degradation as honor, their abuse as worship. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief must have been psychologically devastating. The training process for sacred prostitutes reveals the systematic nature of this exploitation. Young girls were often dedicated to temples by their families, either as religious offerings or as solutions to economic hardship. Once inside the temple system, they underwent years of conditioning designed to break down their resistance to sexual exploitation. They learned ritual dances, religious songs, and ceremonial procedures that gradually accustomed them to sexualized performance. They were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the goddess they served. They were indoctrinated with the belief that refusing sexual service to temple visitors would anger the gods and bring divine punishment. The most disturbing aspect of this indoctrination was how it inverted normal moral categories. In regular society, promiscuity was shameful and chastity virtuous. In the temple system, sexual availability became virtue, and refusal became sin. Women who had been raised with conventional moral codes faced complete psychological reconstruction. Many sacred prostitutes developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma. Contemporary texts describe women who became withdrawn, spoke in incoherent religious language, or exhibited bizarre behaviors. These symptoms were interpreted as signs of divine possession rather than psychological breakdown. The temple hierarchies also created cruel competitions among the women. Higher-ranking prostitutes enjoyed better living conditions, more prestigious clients, and greater protection from abuse. This created incentives for women to compete against each other rather than unite against their exploitation. The system turned victims into accomplices in their own oppression. The male temple staff, who managed these institutions, developed elaborate justifications for their role in the system. They weren't pimps, they were religious administrators. They weren't facilitating exploitation, they were maintaining sacred traditions. They weren't profiting from women's bodies, they were serving the God's will. These justifications reveal how even the perpetrators of systematic abuse can convince themselves of their virtue. By framing exploitation in religious terms, temple officials avoided confronting the moral reality of what they were doing. They created elaborate theological explanations that transformed cruelty into kindness, abuse into service. The customers who used these services employed similar psychological mechanisms. They weren't purchasing prostitutes, they were making religious offerings. They weren't exploiting vulnerable women, they were participating in sacred mysteries. They weren't satisfying base desires, they were fulfilling divine commandments. This transformation of exploitation into religious duty reveals one of the most sophisticated forms of ideological control ever devised. By making sexual slavery a religious obligation, Mesopotamian society created a system that was virtually immune to moral challenge. How could anyone oppose practices that were commanded by the gods themselves? The durability of these institutions is testament to their psychological effectiveness. Sacred prostitution persisted in various forms throughout the ancient world for over 2 millennia. Even when political systems changed and new religions emerged, the basic model of religious sexual exploitation adapted and survived. The practice only began to decline with the spread of monotheistic religions that rejected the entire framework of divine sexuality. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all condemned sacred prostitution as abomination, though it took centuries to completely eliminate the practice from their territories. But even as these institutions declined, their legacy persisted in more subtle forms. The basic principle that women's sexuality could be commodified for allegedly higher purposes remained embedded in many cultures. The specific religious justifications disappeared, but the underlying logic of exploitation adapted to new circumstances. As we reach the end of our journey through the legal nightmares of ancient Mesopotamia, we're left with revelations that are both horrifying and illuminating. The Code of Hammurabi and related laws weren't aberrations of primitive society. They were sophisticated instruments of oppression created by advanced civilizations at the height of their power and influence. These laws reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. They show how easily societies can rationalize systematic cruelty when it serves the interests of those in power. They demonstrate how law can be twisted from an instrument of justice into a weapon of oppression. Most disturbingly, they show how victims of systematic abuse can be convinced to participate in and defend their own exploitation. The women of ancient Mesopotamia faced horrors that are almost unimaginable to modern minds. They could be bought and sold like livestock. They could be executed for adultery, while their male partners faced lesser punishment. They could be burned alive, impaled, or drowned for violating sexual norms. They could be forced into religious prostitution and told it was divine service. They lived under constant surveillance, their every action scrutinized for signs of rebellion against masculine authority. Yet these women weren't passive victims. Despite the overwhelming oppression they faced, many found ways to resist, survive, and even thrive within the constraints of their society. Archaeological records show women who became successful merchants, influential priestesses, and power brokers within the limited spheres available to them. Their resilience in the face of systematic persecution offers both inspiration and sobering recognition of human adaptability to even the worst circumstances. The sophisticated nature of Mesopotamian oppression also offers lessons about how discrimination operates in complex societies. The Code of Hammurabi didn't simply declare women inferior. It created elaborate legal frameworks that made inequality seem natural, inevitable, and divinely ordained. It used economic incentives, social pressure, and religious authority to convince entire populations that systematic injustice was actually moral order. These historical examples remind us that the freedoms many women enjoy today aren't natural rights that societies naturally evolve toward brings. They're hard-won victories achieved through centuries of struggle against deeply entrenched systems of oppression. Every generation must actively choose to maintain and expand these freedoms, or risk losing them to forces that would gladly return to older models of control. The legacy of ancient Mesopotamian law also appears in contemporary debates about women's rights, religious freedom, and cultural traditions. When modern societies grapple with questions about female dress codes, marriage laws, or gender roles in religious institutions, they're often revisiting issues that were first systematically codified thousands of years ago in places like Babylon and Ashur. Understanding this history doesn't mean that all traditional practices are inherently oppressive, or that all change represents progress. But it does mean that we should be skeptical of claims that discriminatory practices are natural or traditional, when they often reflect the calculated designs of ancient power structures rather than organic cultural evolution. The study of ancient law also reveals how oppression adapts and evolves, rather than simply disappearing. The specific mechanisms change. Few modern societies practice ritual drowning or public impalement, but the underlying logic of control often persists in subtler forms. Legal discrimination may be replaced by economic pressure, social ostracism, or cultural expectations that achieve similar results through different means. Perhaps most importantly, the Mesopotamian experience shows us that systematic oppression requires systematic resistance. The elaborate legal codes that controlled women's lives weren't natural phenomena. They were human creations that required constant enforcement and social support. This means they could be challenged, modified, and eventually overthrown by human action, though the process might take generations. The women who lived under these harsh laws couldn't have imagined a world where their descendants might vote, own property, practice professions, or make independent choices about their own lives. Their struggles and sacrifices, often unrecorded in historical documents, laid the foundations for freedoms that later generations would build upon. Each small act of resistance, each assertion of dignity in the face of degradation, each refusal to completely surrender hope contributed to the slow process of change. As we face contemporary challenges to women's rights and human dignity, the lessons from ancient Mesopotamia remain relevant. They remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that freedoms can be lost as well as gained, and that eternal vigilance remains the price of liberty. They also remind us that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression are ultimately human creations that can be challenged and changed by human determination. The cuneiform tablets that preserve these ancient laws now serve as warnings rather than guidelines. They document what happens when societies choose power over justice, control over freedom, and fear over love. They stand as monuments to human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, reminding us that the choice between these paths remains as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. In studying these dark chapters of human history, we honor the memory of countless women who suffered under unjust laws, while also equipping ourselves to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. Their stories, carved in stone and preserved across millennia, continue to speak to us across the centuries, warning us about the eternal human temptation to use law as an instrument of oppression rather than liberation. The Code of Hammurabi stands in the Louvre today, not as a celebration of ancient achievement, but as a sobering reminder of how far humanity has traveled and how far we still have to go. Its dark truths about power, law, and human nature remain as relevant today as they were when first carved into black stone in the palaces of ancient Babylon. The question that remains for each generation is whether we will learn from these lessons or find ourselves condemned to repeat them. What aspects of this ancient system of oppression resonate most strongly with you? Have you recognized parallels in contemporary societies or legal systems? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this exploration of history's dark corners has engaged you, subscribe for more journeys into the human past. Remember, understanding where we've been is essential for determining where we're going. The women of ancient Mesopotamia deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage and dignity they could muster. Their stories, preserved in law codes meant to control them, ultimately serve as testimony to the human spirit's refusal to be completely crushed by injustice. In studying their struggles, we honor their memory, while strengthening our resolve to build a world where such systematic oppression becomes truly a thing of the past.